Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Rick Rowden from School of International Service here at AU. Thank you for coming out today. We have a very interesting discussion today, and we're really pleased to welcome our four speakers. We have Mandeep Tiwana from Civicus, who will talk about their annual report that they publish every year about the state of civic space around the world. And he will give us sort of like a broad overview of the global situation. And then we have three other speakers from the World Movement for Democracy, which is based here in Washington at the National Endowment for Democracy. And we have Ryota Jonin, who is who's the director there. And we have two other speakers who are from, Ryota will speak about the country cases of El Salvador and Georgia and what's going on with civic space in those two countries. And then we have two other fellows at World Movement for Democracy. We have, I'm going to try to say her name. We have Chiranti Senanayake from Sri Lanka, and she'll talk about the country case of Sri Lanka and what's going on there. And then we have Renu Oduala from Nigeria, who is project director of NGO Connect Hub NG in Nigeria. And she'll be talking about what's going on with civil society and civic space in Nigeria. So without further ado, let's go to Mandeep.
Thanks a lot, Rick, and thank you very much for inviting us here today. And it's great to see all of you here to come speak with us. I think it's good that we can have a more inclusive conversation afterwards. So I was just thinking maybe we should make a semicircle, but that probably will upset your plans for recording. So anyway, my remit today is to speak about civic space conditions and how they impact the struggle for accountability and democracy around the world. I represent Civicus, which is a global civil society alliance dedicated to strengthening the health and conditions of civil society. We are headquartered in Johannesburg, and we have members and partners around the world. I'm currently based at the New York Liaison Office, and my name is Mandeep Tiwana. So it's good that we're having this conversation because later this week, the United States, along with Costa Rica, Zambia, South Korea, and the Netherlands is going to be hosting a online summit for democracy. So it's really good. And at that summit, there's going to be several conversations about, what countries have done to achieve democracy. And hopefully there'll be also conversations about what's ailing democracy across the world. And I know colleagues will be speaking about that a little bit later. But it's important for us, or at least it's important for decision makers to understand perhaps that democracy is more than just nominally free elections. There's something deeper about that in democracy. And one aspect that makes democracy real is civic space. Understood simply, civic space is the ability of people to come together, to organize, to communicate, to shape the political, economic, and social structures around them. So it's the ability to make transformative change, but especially for the excluded to do this without hindrance. So civic space rests on the freedoms of peaceful assembly, expression, and association, as far as our definition is concerned. And the state has a duty to protect these fundamental freedoms. They are part of the constitution of almost every country. They are enshrined in international law. But our research at Civicus, through the Civicus Monitor, which is a research collaboration of over 20 organizations around the world, finds that, in fact, states are sometimes the biggest violators of civic freedoms. So instead of doing their role of protecting these civic freedoms, enabling people to exercise these civic freedoms, they are actually actively impeding the exercise of these civic freedoms, which is the irony of the world that we live in today. Despite the fact that they have agreed to these. So And we find that in our research, we've just produced a global findings report which looks at civic freedoms across 2022. And our top findings are harassment and intimidation of activists, journalists, their human rights work. The restrictive laws designed to stop people's mobilization. So the power of peaceful protest is being impeded, and also worryingly, the arbitrary detention of protesters as punishment. So there's lots of challenges and impediments that are being put on the right to peaceful assembly, the right to freedom of association, the right to freedom of expression. But shockingly, our research finds, and I'll show some statistics a little bit later, that 2 billion people around the world, or 28% of the world's population, live in countries where there is no civic space. So if you speak truth to power, you try to criticize those who hold power, you try to make transformative change in society, there's an extremely high likelihood that you may be thrown into prison, you may be hounded into exile, or you may even be killed. And these countries are actually quite powerful. Some of these countries, they include China, they include Russia, they include Egypt, they include Saudi Arabia, they include Iran, United Arab Emirates, etc., where there's absolutely no civic space. They also include a number of one-party states and dictatorships like Belarus, Cuba, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Nicaragua, Syria, Turkmenistan, and so on. And these are, of course, countries which are extremely authoritarian. They have a history of authoritarianism. But what worries us is that there's also been regression of civic space in democracies. Places where we thought that the argument for democratic rights, for democratic freedoms had been won. And that's most worrying. In the United Kingdom, there's been a new law that's been passed in 2002 called the Police, Crime and Sentencing and Courts Act. It gives police extraordinary powers to impede protests in the name of preventing serious disruption, distress, and loss and lack of public amenities. So that remains a challenge. The UK is also considering a further repressive legislation, a bill called the Public Order Bill, that is particularly designed to stop the civil disobedience activities of climate activists and environmental activists. India, which bills itself as the world's largest democracy, has also a huge civic space challenge. Think tanks that have been that have a history of uncovering gross human rights violations, media that uncover corruption in high places, or civil society that organizations that that work on human rights issues, they have had themselves being subjected to intimidation through raids, as well as through denial of international funding. And they include the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, after they aired a documentary, the Center for Policy Research, which is one of the country's best known think tanks, Oxfam India, Amnesty India have also had huge challenges towards exercising their civic space. Tunisia is another country where we thought that democracy was starting to take root. It was the first country to have a revolution in the so-called Arab Spring, or the People's Uprisings that shook Middle East and North Africa, but also led to protests further down in Africa in the second decade of the 21st century. There, the president has consolidated all power. He's dismantled government institutions, tried to reduce the power of the judiciary, used law enforcement machinery to go after critics. So it's another challenging situation that remains there. In other countries too, where their democratic institutions are being systemically dismantled, in places like Hungary and Israel and Philippines, which remain a huge challenge, because democracy takes a lot of effort to build institutions, to build processes, to build a culture. And when the despotic leaders come and they reverse that, it's a huge challenge. Nevertheless, people continue to speak out and people continue to protest. Our research at Civicus finds that there were protests substantial protests in over 130 countries in 2022 itself. And oftentimes women were at the forefront of these protests. A lot of these protests were for the advancement of gender justice, for the LGBTQI plus rights. And some of them were also very brutally attacked, as in the case of Iran, where police used lethal violence against protesters. They also carried out targeted executions of people, and there's a huge challenge of mass imprisonment of people in Iran merely for seeking equal rights and to be free from repressive modes that undermine people's personal liberty. So the gendered nature of attacks on human rights defenders and on protests remains a huge challenge. But there have been some successes that civil society has also achieved. For instance, in Honduras, there's a group of water rights defenders called the Guapenal Water Rights Defenders, who were advocating against destruction of their water resources by a group of extractive industries. They were in preventive detention. They were in pretrial detention for 2.5 years. They were released by the country's top court, thanks to civil society organizing and the efforts of many others, but also through a global campaign for their release. So there are successes too. In Sri Lanka, there was a people's mobilization, which led to the resignation of a president who belonged to a corrupt and despotic political dynasty. Unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, the old guard has reasserted itself, and restrictions have come, and which I think we'll speak about later in the conversation today. But which also shows us that you have to remain continually vigilant on civic space issues to challenge them. But improvements can also happen. Our research finds that in Chile, President Gabriel Boric's government has instituted reparations for human rights abuses. There's been a framework to protect human rights defenders and journalists, which has led to improvements in civic space in that country. Here in the United States, too, civic space has improved due to the efforts of the federal government, particularly on police accountability, and also with regards to a less contentious relationship with the media that the present federal government has, and whereas the last government tried to ridicule and undermine the media, which is an important pillar of democracy. But the reality is that around the world, civic space is hugely, hugely contested. And just 3.2% of the world's population live in countries that we classify as open on the Civicus Monitor. And I'm going to show you some statistics in just a minute. But the challenges are enormous. And they were brought to us in a very poignant way. In fact, there was this member of Civicus, a human rights lawyer. His name is Thulani Maseko. He was gunned down outside his house in January this year, and his killers continue to roam free. And said that the orders for his assassination came from high above. Yes, I'm about to finish. So, with all the civic space challenges, you can imagine what impact this causes in the fight for equal rights, to uncover human rights abuses, to uncover corruption. And we can speak a little bit more about that. So I just want to point you to the slide there. Rick, would it be okay? So that's the slide on the Civicus Monitor, and that's our report. So you see, we measure civic space according to 5 categories. You see those countries, which is open, narrowed, obstructed, repressed, and closed. And now we can just go back to the map. And I'll show you. So you can see all those countries in red. That's where there's absolutely no civic space. You see the countries in amber, which we classify as repressed. That's the second worst condition. And then you have the middling countries in yellowish, which is the obstructed civic spaces. And then you have the narrowed civic space here in the United States is under the narrowed category. And there's a few other places like Namibia and Australia and Mongolia, which is the narrowed category. And then you have the dark green, the open spaces, which is a small handful of Nordic countries. And Canada and Uruguay in the global south, you'll see, and there's Cabo Verde in the global and Ireland and others, and New Zealand. But we can go back to the the slide. So you'll see, according to our research, just 3.2% of the world's population live in countries where they are enabling civic space conditions. And you can see that there's a large part of the world's population actually don't have access to civic space, despite it being part of the constitutions of almost every country. And every year we publish a state of civil society report. So I also shared some findings from our state of civil society report. That's a picture from a protest in Iran, which of course got the imagination of a lot of Iranians, young people and people who believe in justice and equality. And we are soon going to be releasing our State of Civil Society report. So that's on the next slide. I just wanted to share this as an important part of our work, is to carry out interviews with activists and work with them. So just the next slide, Rick. I think it should play by itself. There's underneath. There's a player there. And I can end on that note. So this report is going to be released on Thursday. So please do read it and do circulate it. And thank you.
Thanks very much, Mandeep. Let's shift gears now to Ryota from World Movement for Democracy, who's going to give us a little more of a granular look at a couple of country case studies focusing on Georgia and El Salvador.
Thank you. I'm going to go over there and see if I can show a slide. Let's see. Well, thank you so much, Rick, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ryota Jonen, and I'm director of the World Movement for Democracy. I don't want to assume everyone knows about what democracy is, so let me just say a few words. The World Movement is a global network of civil society activists, human rights defenders, practitioners. When we say practitioners, we're talking about members of parliament and government officials, scholars and funders who come together and collectively working toward democracy, building democratic future. And we do so in different ways, but three main things I want to say. One, we connect people. We connect people like you so that you can learn from each other. So we facilitate peer learning. Second, we share resources. We gather your stories and share the stories to our community so that they can get inspiration, they can get motivated to continue our work. And the third, yes, inspiration. We need to celebrate victories. Yes, Mandeep gave us a very difficult view of what's happening today. And we share very much so. But there are so many small victories that we need to take a moment to see how we achieve those victories. Small victories, if you start collecting small victories, become big victory. So we are trying to inspire our community by telling a story of small victories. And we do these things, three things, in the three major areas. One, the civic space. Mandeep talked about what the civic space is. But second, we focus also around promoting inclusive governance. Civil society itself cannot achieve democracy. We need people in governance helping democracy deliver. So we need to create institutions. We need to make policies that work for the community. So we have this specific initiative called Crossover, encouraging young activists, young leaders to actually get involved in politics. We cannot ignore politics. So how do we do that? Again, we are collecting experience of those people who move from civil society to government and telling a story and using that as resources to equip future leaders. And then finally, we focus on young people. We are building the democratic future. We are training the democratic future. To do that, we are bringing people like Shiranti, Renu, and other young activists together and help them to be a global leader. So we are doing all of this. But today I want to focus on civic space a little bit. And Mandeep mentioned Tulani Maseko of Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland. He was extremely important human rights defender in Southern Africa. He was killed. He was shot dead in front of his wife and kids in his own house. No one has been arrested. There's impunity in that community. Silencing civil society, which is our event title today, is not just a trend that we are seeing academically. We actually see it and feel it. And let me tell you a couple more personal examples. 2 years ago, the Ugandan government closed down the operation of about 54 organizations, just because they were carrying out political activities, observing elections, and so on. One of those organizations is called Chapter for Uganda. Chapter for Uganda is a group of human rights lawyers provide legal aid to the groups advocating for LGBTIQ community. They've done a lot of work against the law that government just passed recently. That leader of the organization's name, Nicholas Opio, and he's a great friend of mine, Kari Gowers. He's been arrested, tortured, beaten. We've seen the scars of those, abuses of power by the state. Second example, you may have heard this maybe a month ago. On February 22nd, 222 Nicaraguan political prisoners were flown into the Washington Dulles airport, not so far from here. And because they were in prison, because they were speaking against the government, current government is unfortunately increasingly autocratic government. And just simply because they were critiquing the government's behavior, and trying to enjoy the fundamental freedoms that Mandeep talked about, they were in prison. And they were shipped on an airplane to come here. And many of them lost the citizenship. Government said, "You're not Nicaraguans anymore. We are taking out your citizenship." So weaponization of citizenship is also a very concerning thing. Again, these are our friends. These are our colleagues. These are not just academic studies and stories that we hear. This is our story. This is a personal fight that we feel very committed to. Mandeep talked about different trends, but let me just capture 6 different ways. When we say shrinking civic space, there are 6 different trends. One, the increasing number of hurdles that you have to go through if you want to organize yourself as an association. The second, government increasingly tell you which regions, which type of activities you can engage in. Third, sanctions on speech and publication, what you can publish, what you can say on the public speeches. And then there are limitations around communications, the increasing surveillance, particularly through mobile and the digital space. Some cases, place like Singapore, you think it's a very developed country, but if you're gathering more than 5 people, it's illegal. And prohibiting against funding, where you can get money from. If you're receiving money from USAID, State Department, or organizations like NED, where we work, often they are called foreign agents or have to close down the operation. So last year, we spent some time thinking, okay, how are we going to fight back this closing civic space? So we carry out a year-long consultation with our civil society partners, just as Civicus did with a Civicus lens, and trying to assess where the opportunities that we can actually push back. And here are a couple of things that several things I want to share with you. These are things that came out from the conversation. What's driving the civic space? Counter-terrorism measures that international community often push. You hear the public order bill that often framed as countering terrorism. But there's opportunity. There's growing awareness among this, particularly a major global counterterrorism organization called FATF, Financial Action Task Force, FATF, based in Paris. This is the group of governments who share different knowledges and information, but also assess the risks of money laundering and terrorism activities. But there's a growing awareness among that community how their measure is actually impacting civil society and what they call non-profit sector. So we need to engage in that space. Second, freedom of expression. VDEM, which is another Swedish organization, University of Gothenburg, produces this democracy report. And the Freedom House recently, published a report, Freedom in the World 2023. Both of these reports actually point out that freedom of expression is one place, the first place the government started attacking. So if you want to see the trend of how the civic space is shrinking, normally freedom of expression is the first place to be attacked. So we need to pay attention to that. And to do that, we need to start working together with independent journalists, media, and civil society. How do we build a coalition among us? Digital civic space. I think Renu may be talking about this a little bit. We are seeing growing virtual civic space, right? We're all connected. But this digital space, the international laws and norms are not well settled. But who's shaping the norm? Mandeep talked about legitimacy of international human rights laws and things like this that we are all committed to. But there's nothing like that yet for the digital space. So we need to engage. Don't let the tech people to run and create international norms around this. There are the narratives we need to think about. There's the narrative of battle of narratives, and then donor engagement. There's actually a very interesting paradigm shift in the donor community about how they want to engage and support civic movements and citizen movements on the ground. So we need to take a moment to how to exploit such opportunities. Now, let me get to, I know we got 3 more minutes, but maybe just quickly go through a few examples. El Salvador, you may be hearing a lot about El Salvador nowadays because it's not a great country when we talk about democratic progress. But a few years ago, the government actually introduced this law, Foreign Agent Bill. Under this law, if you're civil society receiving funding from abroad, like USAID, State Department, Swedish government, or European Union, you have to register as a foreign agent. And then you have to pay taxes on the foreign international transfer. And at the same time, the government using the surveillance technology to actually monitor how you communicate with your colleagues. There are clear indication of how they are going after independent journalists and civil society organization in El Salvador. But luckily, civil society, many of us worked with Salvadorian civil society for years and years and years. And that resilient civic space, civil society that we had in El Salvador were able to organize themselves, really organize a collective voice. And they even come up with a coalition among the civil society. And that led to the sort of increasing support from the international community. I'm aware that US government, European government, UN were heavily engaging in conversation with the Salvadorian government to actually drop this law. And in August 2022, last year, we're able to bring UN Special Rapporteur on the Freedom of Expression Assembly. And we're basically trying to put additional pressure on the government, saying international community looking at this. But a few days before he actually went to El Salvador, he received a letter from the El Salvador government saying we're officially withdrawing the law. So international pressure actually work, but it's based on the voices of the local community. And there has to be a collective voice that we're talking about. And the remaining minute, let me just say a few things about Georgia. You might have heard this also in international news earlier this month. The Georgian government, parliament introduced a law called Registration of Foreign Agent. And if you're receiving a funding from foreign sources, you have to register as agent of foreign influence, in other words, foreign agent. And it's very similar to what we hear from Russia, Nicaragua, and many places. It's a copycat approach that many autocratic governments are doing. But this process actually moved very quickly. Unlike El Salvador, it took a couple of years for the government to introduce, go through the parliament, and out of discussion within the community, but this was moving very quickly. So within a week after the government introduced this draft law, the civil society organized themselves and put together a joint statement with 330 organizations. And with that document, the international community mobilized. And this is that, you see the American ambassadors, European ambassadors speaking out on the public media, international community is speaking out. And unlike El Salvadorian case, international media like BBC, New York Times, all of this major international news were following the case. And then finally, people took this issue on the street. But interestingly, what happened on the street is not the civil society leading action on the street. Young people, general public, went on the street and saying, this doesn't reflect our future. Our future belongs to Europe. They were not using the argument, legal argument, why this law is against Georgian constitution and such. It wasn't about that. It was much more emotion than saying, this is not us. Our society belongs to this future toward Europe. And that drove some successful campaign for the government to drop. And remember 2003, 20 years ago, Georgia had a revolution. And that revolution was the expression of Georgian society saying, we want to be part of Europe. So young people remembering that and now echoing it. And I think that's a very important moment that you need to think about. Now, just finally, looking at examples of El Salvador, Georgia, and many other cases, I see it should be a circle, but circle of advocacy. We need to start with mobilizing domestic voices of why this law, why civic space is important. Based on that, we can mobilize the international community. Sometimes we may have international media joining. And then they may support the public voices to push against it. So I hope you may remember this and we can use that as a template for the future. Of course, each country has a different context. We need to understand that. But from World Movement point of view, advocacy starts on the ground from people in the country. So thank you.
Thanks, Ryota. We have a couple of examples there of places where civil society and people have been able to organize and mobilize and push back, which is really what it's going to take in a lot of places. Let me switch next to Chiranti, who's going to talk to us about the situation in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Rick. I'll also head to the podium. So good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I would like to first thank the School of International Service of American University for having me, and Ryota and the team for the opportunity. So I actually am going to speak a little bit about the ground reality in Sri Lanka and really reclaiming democratic spaces after the Gota Gogama civic struggle that happened in Sri Lanka. So Gota Gogama, I know it's a very unfamiliar word, but if I use that word, I'm referring to the civic struggle that took place last year. So why am I speaking about this? Why am I speaking about a so-called protest in a discussion on civic space? Because the first point that I would like to note is that Gota Gogama was much more than people just coming to the streets and expressing their demands. It was actually a demonstration that was intended to convert into a civic space, because it was actually a resident protest where people actually were living in a makeshift village right opposite the presidential office for over 100 days. And it is actually a watershed, or I would say a monumental awakening of people's interest as well as their exercise of their right to demonstration and civic assembly. So that's why I think the civic struggle is something that we could speak about as a fantastic example of people trying to reclaim their civic spaces and also moving on towards system and process change from that point onwards. But whether we actually achieve the change we set out to is a discussion on its own. So let me give you a little bit of context. I'm sure you would have seen Sri Lanka pop up across various news channels, but Gota Gogama, the civic struggle, was actually headquartered in this makeshift protest village, as I said. And this was right up next to the presidential office of the country. So the whole purpose was for us to have a sit-in protest and to demand three things that I have sort of noted in this slide. But the protest lasted over several months. And the idea was that there was collective pressure that was exerted on the government to demand the three things listed here. So the first is the resignation of the then president Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And this was something that the people of Sri Lanka were able to achieve, hence why I put a tick there. But the second demand, which is convening national elections to democratically vote in a new leadership, is something that has not taken place yet, because the prime minister, who actually took over as the president of the country as per the constitutional provisions of the country, continued to hold power and has not called for national elections because he has about 1.5 years left. And he has been citing various reasons for not calling for presidential elections, one being the fact that Sri Lanka does not have a lot of money to spend. But mind you, there was a massive parade that was organized for our National Independence Day, which also cost a bit of money. But so we see where the priorities lie there. And the third demand that was called is to introduce more accountable, transparent, and sustainable public administration systems. Of course, this is a long-term thing, but unfortunately, the protest and the demonstration demands did not result in any sustainable change or movement on the part of the government towards this. But what's interesting about this particular demonstration is that this demonstration was a result of the multidimensional economic crisis that took place in Sri Lanka, where because of a fall in the foreign reserves of the country and a certain trickling macroeconomic effect, people in Sri Lanka did not actually have petrol for the longest time. After COVID, we had what we call a petrol sort of work from home situation, because we didn't even have petrol to go to work. And then there were situations where there was no gas available in the country. So it was technically a breakdown of living conditions as well as systems that were in the country. So based on this context, I would like to speak a little bit about what is happening now. Has Gota Gogama and the civic demonstration, has it resulted in some sort of, considerable change? Or is the situation different? Are civic spaces stronger after the protest or demonstration, as we can call it? Well, unfortunately, there was a crackdown of the Gota Gogama civic protest when it did take place last year, in the form of the president declaring emergency law under the Public Security Ordinance, the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act to actually arbitrarily arrest protesters. And unfortunately, this keeps happening even now under the new government. It seems to just be a change in the person who's taking over the position. There hasn't been any sustainable reform in terms of civic spaces being protected after the demonstration demonstration. So we see that there is, a crackdown of civic democratic spaces in these ways. Firstly, there is police suppression of civic demonstrations that actually took place on the day of the independence, that's the 4th of February, against the new tax or the Inland Revenue Act that was brought in, and the austerity measures that were brought in under the so-called rescue plan for removing Sri Lanka out of its economic problems. Then the second thing is we also see that there is an arbitrary arrest of protesters and political activists and university students and political mobilizers, and most of it is under the disguise of national security, where we're told, where I myself have gone to police stations to represent protesters who've just been dragged out of the makeshift tents that are there at Kota Gogama. Then we see the third sort of way in which the crackdown is happening is that there is a threat of declaration of emergency law, a threat that is where, the president has outright come and said in the national parliament that, he would not tolerate opposition in such a critical situation when Sri Lanka is trying to get out of its economic condition. And the fourth thing is we see that there is a limitation of spaces and public engagement opportunities to organize, like Priyota mentioned before, where we've seen in Sri Lanka as well, where the moment you have more than 10 people, that's considered to be a so-called illegal assembly. So we have to sort of find spaces just to even have a chat about, let's say, civic spaces in Sri Lanka. We would have police officers circulating us and looking at us very suspiciously. So that is the reality that we are in. So, and this actually brings me to the key learnings from the recent crackdowns that the protesters and the demonstrators actually experienced, and how Kota Gogama as a civic space was sort of targeted. Well, the first learning is that Sri Lanka's constitution, the 1978 constitution, it actually has weak constitutional checks and balances in terms of the powers of the executive president. So Sri Lanka has an executive presidency, and the executive president is the executive leader of the country. But the problem is that the executive president has the power to appoint judiciary to the topmost courts in Sri Lanka. And the executive president has the power to hold ministerial portfolios. So most often than not, he is also the Minister of Finance or the Minister of National Security, which actually shows you how much of a lack of check is, because and you control cabinet portfolios in the country. So there are weak constitutional provisions to balance the power of the executive president. Then secondly, we also see that there are certain shortcomings in the universal franchise and election system in Sri Lanka. A good example is how the executive president is using his power to postpone the local government elections that are supposed to take place in the country, because there is a fear that an opposition party would actually gain majority at the local government level. And this is being postponed again with the excuse that Sri Lanka does not have the finances to actually organize a national election. Then the third learning is that we see that the bureaucracy and the process-related obstacles of really registering civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations in the country, where, when you go to, let's say, the NGO secretariat in the country, this has been my experience to register an organization, they would even tell you stuff like, you're trying to do what the government is supposed to do. How can we allow you to register your organization if you are trying to do technically what we are supposed to do? So there is quite a bit of territory over what the government is supposed to do and the civic society is supposed to do. So it's very difficult to get NGO registrations now in Sri Lanka. And there is also this funny system where you have to first, the best way is to register non-governmental organizations as companies limited by guarantee, and then to try and get the NGO secretariat registration, which is ridiculous because when you're applying for funding, etc., that actually acts as an obstacle when you are registered as a company. So that is also supposed to be a bureaucratic sort of barrier. Then the fourth learning is the fact that civic spaces in Sri Lanka, democratic spaces in Sri Lanka are extremely vulnerable to partisan politics, where we see political party agendas, political party vendettas sort of creeping into civic spaces. And that is also an attempt to destabilize civic spaces, because when people wish to be politically neutral, they don't have the opportunity because you have the influence of party politics. And then we also see there's a shortage in national policy engagement spaces for the civil society. Because I'm running a little short of time, I'm going to actually move on to sort of like the key recommendations for short-term, mid-term, as well as long-term action. And I'll couple it a little bit with the work that we have done through Hype Sri Lanka, which is South Asia's first and only youth empowerment incubator, just to show you how we're trying to sort of connect civic spaces to systems and policy change. So firstly, the first short-term action is, of course, releasing those who have been arbitrarily arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which was brought in 1979 as a short-term measure, but continues to this day. Then the second thing is, of course, convening an independent investigation on the crackdown on protests that is taking place under the Wickremesinghe government. But this is also something that has been demanded by the civil society, but has not been provided. So the work that we do is actually involved with midterm and long-term action. So in terms of midterm action, the first thing is standardizing the national registration and management systems of civil society and non-governmental organizations. So for this, the work that we do is we have this small project called Project Nexus. That's where we try and create a database of all the voluntary social service organizations operating in Sri Lanka. And we provide capacity building in terms of registering the organization, because most often than not, civil society, especially youth civil society, operate at a grassroots level. And since they don't or can't register with the government, they have issues with funding, reporting. So we're trying to sort of find a solution for that. Then the second thing is to, of course, repeal and replace laws permitting the government to crack down on civic spaces, like the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And then there's another one called the Public Security Ordinance. And the civil society has been vehemently advocating for this to be changed, but the government has been using the excuse of national security to allow it to continue. Then the third midterm action is, of course, creating physical and online protected spaces for having town halls and assemblies. So since it's difficult for us to gather physically, through Hype Sri Lanka, we actually do this thing called Town Hall Dialogue. That's where we actually use Zoom and other online spaces to bring civic activists together to speak about and act on issues. Then finally, speaking about the long-term action, there is a need for a new constitution for Sri Lanka, where to sort of replace the 1978 constitution and to bring in a constitution that's endemic to the country, that suits the development needs of the country, and that also ensures fundamental rights protection, rule of law, etc. One final point is, of course, setting up subcommittees and commissions and attaché systems for making sure that citizens can participate in national government's processes. So what happens usually is, just so that governments can appear woke, they usually set up, these youth subcommittees and these, women leadership groups, but unfortunately, they don't result in any sort of tangible change. So it's just a tick the box inclusion initiative. And what we're trying to do is we have this thing called the Hype Policy Tank, which is the only volunteer-run think tank in Sri Lanka to get young people interested in policy and system-driven change. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'm sorry if I took a little bit of time. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Next, we'll hear from Rinu Oduala from Nigeria, and she's going to talk about the situation there. Do you want to show your quick video? You have a quick video first,
yes,
and a few slides.
Can I borrow you, Vic? Can you please?
I'll jump on it, yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you for watching that short video. There are actually a bit more scenes, but I wanted to keep it short. After this protest in Nigeria, the young protesters who were on the streets were shot at. Many of them were injured, many of them were maimed, many are still in prison, by the way, just for simply protesting. Imagine living in a country where standing up against corruption, speaking against human rights, your work against, towards social justice could get you killed, harassed, could get your life at risk or in danger. Imagine living in a country where, peacefully protesting against police brutality and bad governance could and has resulted in a massacre of young protesters. Unfortunately, this is the situation for young activists around the world, as you've heard from Yota, Chira, even our director from Civicus here, for many people around the world. Governments around the world, are using many tactics and reasons to shut down civic spaces. For us in Nigeria, they say they want to maintain control. Some of the reasons are also to silence dissent in Nigeria. If we can move on to the next slide, please. As an activist in Nigeria, in organizing and all of that, I have experienced firsthand the consequences of government efforts to shut down civic spaces, both online and offline, and also the challenges to pushing back on these spaces. So I would be talking more of the on-ground experience. In Nigeria in 2019, the government passed a controversial law. This is not new. You've heard it from Yota and Chira, and also a director from Civicus, on NGOs and their registration. So NGOs were required to register wherever their source of fundings are from. I mean, as a normal observer, you would say, well, okay, probably this is good or something. But then many of these tactics are not to sort of regulate or anything. They are actually to silence dissent, to make sure that CSOs do not get to operate as effectively as they can. So there are many challenges, just like I said. Other tactics apart from the registration, disinformation, smear campaigns against activists, harassment, physical intimidation, threats. We can go on and on about this threat. As I like to introduce myself as one of the troublemakers from Nigeria, making good trouble, of course. And as a good troublemaker myself, I have actually experienced the efforts of government trying to shut down voices, especially from the young people's perspective. I frontlined the NSAS protests, a short clip which you just saw on video. That movement is a movement against police brutality and bad governance in Nigeria. And due to that, I've been tagged a terrorist myself by the Nigerian government. So I stopped calling myself a terrorist. I rather said a troublemaker. My bank accounts have been frozen. My passport has been seized. I've been placed on a no-flight list by the Nigerian government. So from the experiences with Chira and Ryota, you see that these experiences are not just on paper, they are actually happening in real life. But then they're good news, which with the pushback from CSOs and activists. Yes, they've tried their possible best to shut down these voices, but we refuse to be intimidated. We refuse to let our voices be shut down. So some of the ways we're pushing back, one is building coalitions with CSOs like Civicus, like National Endowment for Democracy, other local media organizations, also, organizations like that of Chira, IPE Sri Lanka, in ensuring that we amplify our voices to solidify those causes, because when you stand alone, then the government can pick you out. But when you stand together, it's harder to be able to shut down, those causes and your voices. So we do connections, build coalitions with civil society organizations, like-minded individuals, like yourself, sitting down in this room to help build support for our causes. Like I said, there's significant challenges, but then we are also building, connections on social media. These days, Ryota has talked about that. Online spaces are becoming part of civic spaces for young people. Many mass movements, as you've seen recently, have emerged through social media, like the Black Lives Matter movement, the NSAS, the Arab Spring movement, and all of that. So young people are increasingly turning to online spaces as safe spaces for them to organize. And we've seen threats to these spaces as well. But then social media has also served as table fronts. The government has refused to create tables for young people. So young people are now creating their own tables through the help of social media to mobilize, to crowdfund, to organize for their own causes. Another way we've been pushing back is through decentralization. Just like I said, the governments around the world have seen leaders of labor unions, trade unions, and I've harassed them because they've shown themselves to be faces of those movements. So one of the things we do is to decentralize those movements by not making obvious that there are any leaders of those movements. Another is consistent conversations. Young people in protecting civic spaces, especially for us in Nigeria, hosting consistent conversations on these issues that matter most to us. We've seen that there are, how do I say this? The fights may have gone off the streets. You have repression by police officers, soldiers, and all of that, or shutting down of these spaces, just as we've seen. Can we go to the next slide, please? As we've seen in Nigeria, we had also Twitter being shut down in Nigeria, so young people could not organize for a while effectively through Twitter. But then young people, like I said, have now created their own tables through these media platforms, through also having consistent conversations. Conversations are very, very important. I was trying to, pinpoint out I think the last slide on the top right screen, saying digital rights are human rights. Those were one of the protests that we had in Nigeria. By saying the fight may have gone off, the streets, may have gone off TV screens, international media organizations may have stopped covering, this mass movement and this protest. It doesn't mean that the fight has stopped. So young people are using their platforms increasingly to make sure that those issues are on the front burner. Also organizing peaceful protest and campaign in order to ensure that those issues are not forgotten by the international civil society organization and the world. Then to the change, these efforts, despite shutdown, despite dissent, despite repression, have not gone unnoticed. For the NSAS protests, we managed to ensure that the Nigerian government and the criminal unit that has been leading to the killings and the extrajudicial killings, the torture of young Nigerians for a very long time. Although we think that it was on paper, but at least we managed to enact that change. There are lessons, like I said, the risk and dangers that come from speaking out against dissent, from trying to push back against government efforts to silence civil society and voices in Nigeria. But then, even like I said, the struggle for freedom is never fought and won. You have to fight it all over and all over again. I'm running out of time, but then can we go to the next slide? Like I said, we've been able to push back against attempts to silence us. And today we're still speaking up, showing that these issues matter, these causes matter. Next slide, please. Silence is not an option. And I would like to speak to you as a young person. I haven't heard from, 3 other passionate people who are pushing for democracy around the world. At the heart of every democracy are the voices of its citizens. And when governments seek to silence these voices, when they seek to shut down these spaces, when they seek to suppress dissent, it is a denial of the basic rights to speak, to be heard, and to fight for what you believe in. Like I said, the fight for struggle, the fight for civic spaces, the fight for human rights is not an individual fight like that of, or a country, limited to a country like that of Nigeria or that of Sri Lanka or that of Malaysia or even, in El Salvador, just like as we made example of. It's a fight across the world that we all have to fight and believe in. We may be intimidated, but we must never stop speaking up because even if it's difficult, even if it's unpopular. I think Angela Davis said that I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. So I urge you, whether sitting at the back of the room, sitting at the front of the room, to look around you and look for the things that you cannot accept and begin to change those things. One thing I'd like you to look at the screen as well, with the quotes. One thing I would like to say is that the time for action is now to build a world where democracy, where human rights, where justice, they're not just mere words, they're not just words on paper, but then they're reality for every one of us. So again, I ask you, are you ready to join the revolution for justice and for democracy? Thank you.
This is why you're not in Nigeria, you're in Kenya now. Thank you very much, Renu. Thanks to all of our speakers. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions. We'd ask you to please use the microphone up here because this is being videoed for our YouTube audience. So please come on up and ask your question at the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very presentations. I'm Gerhardt from the Research Center here at SIS. I wanted to ask for a little bit more root cause analysis, and specifically, who else is accountable besides the governments that are beginning to do this repression? And just by way of hint, maybe along the lines of, where does international business fit into that root cause analysis? And where does the development industrial complex fit into that analysis? Thank you. Specifically, our government, perhaps.
It's a great question. Are there other questions right now? Yeah.
All right. Hi. Yes, thank you so much. It was actually deeply depressing, but you were very uplifting at the end, so thank you. My name is Naomi Hussain. I'm also at the Accountability Research Center. We care a lot about the stuff that you've been talking about here. I was myself involved for a number of years in a large comparative study of closing civic space and implications for development, which you may have come across at some point. And one of the things that I wanted to raise with you is the possibility. There's two things I want. One, I want to ask you. One, I want to discuss with you a bit. One is, isn't civic space, the way we saw it in the post-Cold War, really the historic anomaly, really? That moment of democratization, of relative economic well-being and relative liberalism, if you like, was a moment where all around the world we saw an expansion of civic space. And that does seem to have gone now. We have a lot of economic crisis around the world and economic insecurity. Are those the things that are associated with what you're describing as a shrinkage of civic space? But I would also take issue, I have always taken issue through my research, very large literature review, on this question of shrinking civic space. And isn't it actually the case that civic space is changing in nature? Many of you mentioned the fact that digital civic space has enlarged. Certainly, there was no digital civic space 20 years ago. That has enlarged. At the same time, we see a load of new, very, very ugly uncivil society actors coming into the space that was previously a space for democratic, progressive, freedom-loving type people, is now a space for nasty right-wing actors as well. So when we say shrinking civic space, we're actually saying what's happening now is that organizations that were previously funded by, if you like, aid agencies that were previously progressive-minded, human rights-oriented, and so on, those are the ones that have no space. But other kinds of civil society, they've got lots of space. So those are two things that I wanted to raise with you. The last thing really is, you mentioned this, right? I think this is a really profoundly important. No, sorry, actually, maybe it was you, Mandeep. I can't remember now. But people talk about democracy as though multi-party elections are the answer, as its beginning and the end. And we see funders, aid funders in particular, worry about what are we going to do in this context of shrinking civic space. And what we see is they withdraw from funding civil society, which is insane. How do you feel about the prospect of just having these organizations funded so that they can last through these periods of democratic decline and pushback? Sorry, I've gone on a lot, but I have lots to talk to you about. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much to both of you. These professors are from something we have here in SIS called the Accountability Research Center. It's a great new initiative. Jonathan Fox emailed me this morning in Colombia saying he's sorry he can't be here today, but it's a great research initiative by our faculty. You guys want to go ahead and take these one by one, or
Yeah. You want to start with?
Yeah.
I can start with the root cause analysis question. That's a really good question that you asked about. But so let's go back to 2000, and you spoke about fall of the Berlin Wall and post Cold War. There was a little bit of hope, and there was this people felt that there would be democracy would flower. But of course, immediately after 2000, you found that there was security discourse started to become very heavy because of 9/11, and governments that used to talk about human rights standards themselves started to lower their standards. So a lot of democratic governments basically, started to normalize torture, extraordinary renditions. So that in itself was very cleverly picked up by a lot of authoritarian states. And then there was the notion of whataboutery. So that's one aspect of the erosion, security discourse being used to undermine fundamental civic freedoms. But then beyond that, there's a few events that have happened. There's the consolidation of market discourse, I think what you talked about. Now, in almost every country in the world, we find that there are people who are extremely wealthy come into politics. There's a tight, or people who are extremely wealthy go into politics. People in politics have a lot of wealth. So there's a tight overlap between political and economic elites in almost every country. They have basically they push forward this notion of making things efficient in the name of privatization. So there's a lot of private interests that are involved, and when civil society and others try to uncover corruption, or when indigenous communities or land rights activists try to speak out against what about development in the sense of economic development, they are attacked through the state, but also by criminal activities of non-state actors. So that remains a huge challenge. But even if we look at the 2011 uprisings, what happened was there was people's mobilizations, and then in 2013 there were big protests in Gezi Park in Turkey and protests in Brazil. So a lot of authoritarian leaders then became very fearful of the power of protest, and they started to push back a lot. And simultaneously, that's led to the rise of right-wing populism in many democracies, where leaders started to put forward this notion of militarism and this harking back to ethno-religious nationalism. So that in itself has also caused this space for the civil bits of civil society to decrease in many ways. And I think that remains a huge challenge from where we see it. But there's also non-state actors who are extremist groups, religious conservative groups, groups that that seek to promote a certain ethnocentric view, who are also eroding space for civil society that seeks to promote democratic values and principles. And that remains, again, huge challenge. What we call is the rise of anti-rights forces, who have many places aligned with the political parties and actually managed to get capture political power in many parts of the world. So it's a mix of so many different aspects. But there's one aspect I also wanted to point out. The world has changed. So you have the rise of China, a country that seeks to provide an alternative model of development, which which even Western democracies have also promoted, the Rwanda model of development, or the UAE, the Gulf despotic countries, the Saudi, not so much the UAE model of development. And also a lot of the Gulf autocracies have basically try to divorce economic development from civil and political freedoms. And they have provided lifelines to governments by providing alternative funding for infrastructure, and basically undermined the development cooperation agreements on enabling environments for civil society, about national ownership of development funds. And they would not have been, many despotic governments would not have been tolerated by the international community had the global geopolitics not changed so dramatically over the past decade or so, which has also led to an erosion of democratic norms. But I think I've spoken too much on this now. Let me hand it over.
Yeah, I don't think I want to answer a question, but I just wanted to say something about the digital spaces that you talked about. And the reason why we're seeing a lot of increasing repression is that one thing you don't want, and one thing governments do not want, is people to gather in one place. And so social media now, there's almost an impossibility. You would find people on there, you would find people with like minds, people who have the same ideas that you have. And once you connect with those people, it's almost a recipe for disaster, and then you have people deciding, oh, we want to go onto the streets, we want to go out and campaign for this and that. And that's one thing governments are increasingly realizing, that these platforms are not just probably to share information, they can also be very great platforms for organizing. And that's why they're, increasingly getting shut down. Thank you.
Okay. So I have a bit different perspective, and I may play the devil's advocate here a little bit, I think, when answering the question. So one root cause I see in terms of, in my personal observation and based on the field experience I have humbly, is that I feel that democracy, especially for people, is really an ideal, a right, and an aspiration. It's, when we say we require democracy, we require change, we're very attracted to democracy and change without really knowing what that entails. And that's, I think, one thing that I have noticed as a root cause, especially from the civic struggle that happened in Sri Lanka. People are very attracted to stepping out onto the streets for demanding for change. But when you ask them, what does change mean to you? What should we do to get there? Unfortunately, they're not willing to engage in that conversation because short-term ideas like removing a leader from power or short-term objectives, they attract people. But when we speak to them about systems and processes, it's not a fun conversation. It's rather a boring conversation. I mean, I would like to share an anecdote, if I may, if that is okay, Rick. I don't know whether we have the time. So just a very humble, like a very small anecdote rather. So I think I shared this with the NED team, the World Movement for Democracy team as well. So when the civic struggle was ongoing in Sri Lanka, the Hype Sri Lanka team actually wanted to organize a small workshop in the protest village about how we can actually use existing policy systems to advocate for change. And this was a workshop that we were organizing in one tent in the village. And around 10 people out of the thousands that were on the street showed up for this particular workshop, right? And we were discussing, and I could hear that there was this loud event that was going on in the next tent, right? Where there were like 10 media channels that were there, and there were around like 50, 60 people who were present. And you would not imagine what that tent, the workshop going on in that tent was about. It was actually a press conference about this report that they had done about this fake Ayurvedic doctor who had said that he had discovered the cure for COVID, and they had done like a study on it, and they had released a report. So there were 6 media channels to cover that particular report. But when we were speaking about policy and systems, no one's really interested. And I think that is a root cause, the fact that we don't have the avenues and the systems and the processes to actually strive for democracy. Because, I mean, this is, again, my humble opinion, because I feel that even the issue is if institutions are weak, we cannot essentially sustain democracy. If systems are weak, we cannot sustain democracy. And that's something I have seen that the public is really not motivated towards. And in terms of the development engagement and how the International Development Project contributes to democracy, a criticism that I have as a member of the international development system is the fact that I feel that democracy has become the conceptual property of the international development system. I feel like the International Development Project actually uses democracy as their own production, as something that they require civil society organizations to, start locally or to introduce locally. But in my opinion, I feel that democracy is a bottom-top approach rather than a top-down approach, because communities, even though they don't know the fancy development lingua, even though they might not know what democracy is as the International Development Project speaks about it, the communities, when you go to the villages, they have their own like town halls, they have their own systems of democratic representation. But what happens now is we have intellectual property over democracy in the International Development Project, and we're going to the locals and telling them this is what democracy is, without really trying to work with them to develop their own identity of local democracy. So I think that is one reason why democracy is not sustaining in the way we're approaching it. So yes, thank you so much.
Okay, just try to answer a few things here. Root causes, who's driving this civic space, shrinking civic space. I think as Mandeep was pointing out historically, this trend didn't start yesterday, right? It started actually in 2004, 2005. That was the broad autocratic reaction to what's happening in places like Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan. Some of us call it color revolution. That's when someone like Putin realized, the people power is extremely dangerous to the world that he was trying to create. So after that, you start seeing the similar law popping up in Ethiopia, Azerbaijan, so many other places. And Arab Spring was simply just a trigger to reinforce that fear. So we are seeing this trend. Now, ultimately, what's driving? For me, it's power, political power. Yes, business power may be, part of it, but those the ones that hold political power, they want to hold on to power. And this is what we see here in the US, everywhere in the world. Once you taste the bit of power, it's hard to let it go, right? So this is why I think it's very important to just echo what Sharanti was saying about importance of building institutions and making sure that there's a check and balance, making sure that there's the rule of law. So I guess civic space is only a symptom of everything else that we've been talking about. And that's why I've been saying from the beginning what World Movement does. Speaking of the business a little bit, whenever we work with international community, places like UN Human Rights Council, and particularly UN Special Rapporteurs, those special mandate holders, Mandeep and Civicus also work with them. We try to make sure that there's a discussion around, promoting the guidance of business and human rights, so that business entities are held accountable to how they engage with, supply chains and all of that. But in addition to that, we also make sure that in the context of civic space, that labor union rights of unions are included, because unions are actually civil society. They are association of workers. So we're trying to make sure that there's out of discussion, not just, civic and political rights element, but social and economic rights are included. Now, is the space shrinking just for the progressive? I don't think so. I think civic space, for me at least, theoretically, is a place for pluralism, right? You gotta embrace the different perspectives. So yes, of course, there may be some people who are not necessarily what we want to see, but they have to have a space. We can't eliminate them from the space. So it's not about political rights and political left issue for me. And I think that notion of right or left has gone. If you look at Mexico today, what's happening?
No, I don't agree that left and right have gone.
Well, I don't think young people, I'm not even young. I don't think people see that way anymore in younger generation when you think about political ideological affiliation. But anyway, my point is this: the political space is for everybody, right? It's not just for progressives, but those ones who like to see a little bit more conservative values. And what we are arguing here, and at least for me, is that international law, international human rights law, actually help to create that mutual space where everyone can express their views and so on. And there's a game, the rule for the game, how we engage in that space. Space like online space today, that rules are not there. That's why you see exploitation by certain group capturing a space and seizing space. And that's why I was suggesting that we need to engage in that space. Don't let the techies shape the norms and the rule of game in that space, because we need to make sure that human rights voices have to be included there. So let me just stop here.
Thank you so much, you guys. So we have about 10 minutes left. Are there additional questions from the audience?
Brilliant panel. Thank you for speaking to us today. And thank you, Dr. Rowden, for putting it together. I'm Akshat Singh. I work with the India program at CSIS, and I do aspire to be put on a no-fly list one day. I think that's a pretty good metric for success. My question to you is about the involvement of opposition parties and corporate interests when it comes to building a consensus in civil society movements. I understand that there is a deep skepticism in involving opposition parties because, of course, they do not have a pure agenda. However, do you believe that it is important, sometimes even necessary, to bring together opposition leaders in an attempt to unite against a common evil? Is there a better approach? And if there is, which one it is and why? Thank you.
Great, very interesting question. And just to build on one of the things I think you were talking about, Ryota, is there is a sense out there that authoritarian regimes are sometimes like sharing notes with each other about like different tactics to keep civil society voices constrained. Can you just maybe speak a little bit more about that? I don't know if you guys would like to go. Who'd like to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in.
Well, perhaps Mandeep will be good if you go before me, if it's okay, if you're comfortable. I feel you have great expertise on it.
So on the question of, yes, I mean, traditionally, when you said, civil society is the space outside the market and the state and the family and civil society organizations should be non-partisan and yes, that, or at least they could be, they follow constitutional methods. But unfortunately, the kind of polarization that's taking place in the world. So where you have certain parties that are promoting agendas of hatred and who are promoting exclusionary agendas against, historically discriminated minorities or against migrant populations and so on. Civil society in some instances perhaps does need to align with the political opposition, and those are the changes. What is sometimes can sometimes be challenging is when civil society leaders make the switch from civil society to politics. That gives some authoritarian people an opportunity to talk that. But in the other hand, in right-wing circles also is the same thing. Think tanks and others also do make that switch. So it's a hard one, but in certain countries, for example, like Zimbabwe or which have effectively one-party rule, their civil society is actually actually stronger than the opposition sometimes, or has to work closely with the opposition to keep those opposition parties going. And so let me stop here on that. And the side note, there's some other important.
Yeah, on this question, recently we had the elections, the National and State Assembly elections in Nigeria. I need to sort of give you an insight into what Nigerian politics is. For Nigerian politics, there's no right wing, there's no left wing, there's no conservative, there's no liberal. Everybody just wants to take power, just do whatever they want. So there's no ideology in the political parties in Nigeria, and that's why I agree with Shira regarding the local democracies in each respective countries. So for us, there's no working with opposition because they don't even want to do anything for civil society or for civic spaces. All they want to do is to get their own turn at oppression and get their own turn at stealing the state resources. So it's a bit different for us in Nigeria, where we actually had the elections stolen and rigged. And we had the discrimination of minorities, a lot of ethnic bigotry and hate against other ethnic groups in Nigeria. So it's a bit hard to work with opposition parties in that kind of space when the agenda, it's not even a bit pure. It's actually very, very evil. They just want to take power and take their own turn at human rights violations. You look at the political parties existing in Nigeria, the APC and the PDP, they all have histories of oppression, of human rights violations, shutting down civic spaces. And there was also another win, which I failed to mention, from pushing back against this effort, which young Nigerians sort of got this new awareness and culture of pushing back against the political elites. And there was actually a mass, I would say, shift in the political terrain in Nigeria, where you actually had young Nigerians decide to vote for a new party entirely, rather than these oppositions or incumbent parties who have, always try to shut down civic spaces. Thank you.
Yeah, civil society working with opposition, I think, yes, in certain contexts, that's the only way. But at the same time, what happens when the eventual political opening happens? That's the moment to really figure out how does civil society actually work with or hold the new government accountable. And a place like Kenya, place like Zimbabwe, when opposition were able to get small piece of cake after the contested elections, there's a negotiated process, and actually opposition were able to get the cabinet membership because the results were so contested, right? And that's when we see the true color of civil society. whether can they remain independent? Can they actually hold your friends accountable? Yes, it's hard, but you have to as a civil society. But at the same time, I have a personal view that I think civil society leaders should think of actually going into the government. Don't be afraid of getting into party politics. Like I said, that's where we build institutions. And when that happens, you shouldn't do so individually. You should create the coalition to go in together. Just to give you one example. 2010, there's a Euromaidan protest in Ukraine. After that, the new government came in. After civil society activists decided to join the government, run for parliament seats. They did so in a very collective way. They gathered 30, 40 people together, representing different political parties, actually, saying, we're going to go in together. We're going to push the one particular agenda. That's the anti-corruption agenda. They were in, because there are 40, 50 people together, they were able to actually create a bloc in the parliament, push certain bills and certain policies. But if you go and mistake that, often people make mistake by going by yourself because you think you got the constituency and supports or something like that. But you need to think as movement, what's the collective strategy? Get involved in politics when the potential political breakthrough happens.
If I may add, I actually feel like the problem with answering the question is it entirely depends on how we view opposition. Why I say that is because I think opposition has now been equated, especially in my generation at least, more to do with, I think, party politics as opposed to ideological opposition. So building on what Ryota said, where he mentioned that young people don't think in terms of Cold War dichotomy of left and right. I do agree with that to a certain extent. And why I say that is because I think now the focus of politics has a lot to do with party politics and policy, as opposed to thinking in terms of, like left wing and right wing. Why I say that is because I'll use an example from Sri Lanka. I would say, like, the idea, if you take populism, for example, we see that, or even the tag of democracy is being used by, parties in Sri Lanka that were traditionally very right-wing, like that were traditionally like that considered themselves to be Marxist or communist, or perhaps, and you see that even like if you take a look at the manifestos of, parties that were originally considered to be communist or Marxist parties, their manifestos now speak a lot about inclusion of communities like the LGBT community. Why is that? Because that is what is technically attractive to the citizens of that country. So I'm not saying that the left-right division is completely like, it has dissipated, but I feel that it is more towards party politics and policies now. And because of that, in my opinion, again, this is purely my opinion, I also believe that when it comes to engaging the opposition and bringing them all together, it has unfortunately reduced to bringing opposition leaders together, as opposed to ideological representatives coming together to discuss like a way forward.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for sharing your views with us today. And thank you all for coming out. Please give my panelists a round of applause. Thank you all very much. This presentation will be uploaded on SIS's YouTube site shortly. Thanks.